In the shadowed heart of Oregon's ancient forests, where the pines whispered secrets older than the mountains themselves, the year 1903 unfolded like a frayed tapestry, heavy with the weight of unspoken sins. The air hung thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, a perpetual twilight filtering through the canopy that seemed to swallow the sun whole. It was here, in a forgotten cabin cloaked by thorns and mist, that Elias and Eliza were bound not just by the accident of birth, but by something far darker, a thread of fate twisted into a noose. From their earliest breaths, they moved as one, their identical faces pale mirrors reflecting a shared soul, eyes like polished obsidian that held the gaze a moment too long, stirring unease in any who dared look. The woods around them were alive, not with the chatter of birds or the rustle of wildlife, but with murmurs that slithered through the underbrush, voices in the dark that called their names on windless nights. These whispers promised belonging, a legacy etched in blood, urging the twins toward a path where love and horror intertwined, where the line between devotion and damnation blurred into oblivion. As the first snows dusted the treetops, the siblings felt the pull strengthen, drawing them deeper into the mystery hidden among the trees, where their choices would birth a forbidden bloodline destined to echo through the ages like a curse unspoken. In the deepest folds of Oregon's Cascade Wilderness, where the ancient firs stood like silent sentinels and the ground was perpetually soft with centuries of fallen needles, a ferocious storm descended on the night of October 17, 1903. The wind howled through the canyons with a fury that seemed almost personal, as if the forest itself raged against what was about to unfold. Rain lashed the isolated cabin in sheets, drumming against the shake roof like impatient fingers, while lightning split the sky in jagged white veins, illuminating the surrounding trees in brief, ghostly flashes. Thunder rolled endlessly, shaking the earth and rattling the single pane of glass in the cabin's only window. Inside that crude shelter of hewn logs and mud-chinked walls, a young midwife named Clara Hensley fought against exhaustion and fear. She had ridden 3 hours through the downpour after a desperate runner from the remote homestead begged her aid. The mother, Abigail Whitlock, lay pale and spent on a straw-filled mattress, her dark hair plastered to her forehead with sweat. Her husband, Jonah, paced the narrow space, his boots thudding heavily, his face etched with a worry deeper than the storm outside. They had chosen this seclusion years earlier, fleeing the crowded valleys and prying eyes of settled towns, seeking a life unbound by society's rules. But tonight, solitude felt like a curse. Abigail's labor had stretched through the darkening hours, her cries mingling with the wind until they seemed indistinguishable. When the first child finally emerged, slick and wailing, Clara wrapped the infant in a threadbare blanket and announced it was a boy. Jonah exhaled in relief, stepping closer to see his son's tiny, fierce face. Yet barely had the cord been cut when Abigail bore down again, her body convulsing with renewed agony. Minutes later, a second child slipped into Clara's waiting hands, a girl, identical in every delicate feature to her brother, from the faint downy hair to the unusual pallor of their skin. The twins' cries rose together, not the thin mewling of ordinary newborns but something sharper, more insistent, harmonizing in a way that sent an involuntary shiver down Clara's spine. Their voices carried through the thin walls and out into the storm, threading through the howling gusts as though answering a call that had been waiting in the darkness beyond the tree line. For a fleeting moment, the wind seemed to pause, the rain to soften, as if the forest leaned in to listen. Lightning flared again, and in that stark light, Clara thought she saw shapes moving between the trunks, tall, indistinct figures that vanished when thunder crashed once more. Jonah and Abigail named them Elias and Eliza, their voices hushed with awe and unspoken trepidation. As Clara cleaned her hands and packed her satchel, she could not shake the feeling that the twins' arrival had disturbed something ancient, that their synchronized cries had summoned more than just parental joy. The storm raged on, but now it felt different, less like nature's indifference and more like a warning, or perhaps an acknowledgement, from the shadowed woods that cradled the cabin in their unyielding embrace as the years folded into one another beneath the unchanging canopy of the Oregon woods. Elias and Eliza grew like twin saplings rooted in the same shadowed soil, their branches intertwining until no one could tell where one ended and the other began. The cabin had grown quieter after the midwife's departure, the storm's fury giving way to a perpetual damp hush broken only by the drip of rain from overhanging boughs and the distant, mournful call of ravens. Abigail and Jonah watched their children with a mixture of wonder and quiet unease, for the twins seemed less like ordinary siblings and more like echoes of a single being split in two. From their earliest toddling steps, Elias and Eliza refused separation. If one wandered toward the creek that wound behind the cabin, the other followed without a word, their small hands clasped as though bound by invisible thread. They played in silence for hours among the ferns and moss-covered logs, building miniature worlds from twigs and stones, yet never quarreled, never raised their voices in the petty disputes that marked other children. Instead, they communicated in a language entirely their own, a rapid murmur of half-words, clicks, and gestures that flowed between them like water over smooth river stones. Abigail would pause at the doorway, dishcloth forgotten in her hands, straining to understand, but the sound slipped away from meaning, leaving only a faint chill at the base of her spine. At night, the twins shared a narrow cot in the loft, their bodies curled together beneath a patchwork quilt, foreheads touching even in sleep. Jonah sometimes climbed the ladder to check on them, lantern held low, and found their eyes wide open in the darkness, staring at the rafters as though listening to something he could not hear. They spoke then of dreams that came to both in perfect unison, vast forests older than time, ringed by towering trunks that bled slow amber sap like tears, and within those rings, tall silhouettes that moved without sound, beckoning with long, pale fingers. The figures never spoke aloud in the dreams, yet the twins woke knowing the same fragments of melody, a low humming that lingered in their throats like a half-remembered lullaby. On certain evenings, when the mist rose thick from the forest floor and the air grew heavy with the scent of wet pine, the children would stand at the cabin's threshold, heads tilted in identical angles, listening. Abigail noticed how their breathing synchronized, how their small chests rose and fell as one. She asked once what they heard, and Eliza turned those unnaturally dark eyes upon her, answering in a voice soft as falling needles, "The trees are telling us who we are." Elias nodded without looking away from the tree line, and in that moment, Abigail felt the cabin shrink around her, as though the walls themselves leaned inward to listen. The whispers the twins heard were growing clearer, threading through the constant rustle of leaves, shaping themselves into promises that belonged only to the two children who had arrived together on that storm-torn night, their bond deepening with every shared breath, every mirrored dream, drawing them inexorably toward a destiny the forest seemed to have prepared long before their birth. The autumn of 1918 arrived cloaked in an unnatural silence, the forest holding its breath as if reluctant to disturb the fragile world within the Whitlock cabin. Elias and Eliza, now 15, had grown tall and slender, their movements synchronized in a way that unsettled the few trappers who occasionally passed through the remote valley. Abigail noticed first how her children's eyes lingered on the empty chairs at the supper table, how they no longer asked when their parents would return from chores that stretched longer into the dusk. Jonah, weathered by years of felling timber and coaxing meager crops from rocky soil, had begun coughing blood into his handkerchief months earlier, dismissing it as the price of hard living. Abigail tended him in quiet desperation, brewing teas from forest herbs that did little to stem the tide. One November evening, as frost etched delicate patterns on the windowpane and the wind carried the faint scent of impending snow, Jonah retired early, his breathing labored and wet. Abigail sat beside him, mending a shirt by lamplight, her fingers trembling from exhaustion. The twins lingered downstairs, unusually still, listening to the creak of the floorboards above. A sudden gust rattled the cabin, snuffing the lantern in the main room and plunging Elias and Eliza into darkness. Upstairs, Abigail rose to relight the stove, striking a match that flared briefly before a draft swept through the chimney. She reached for the kerosene tin on the shelf, tipping it carelessly in her fatigue. The liquid splashed across the dry pine floorboards, soaking into cracks parched from years of wood smoke heat. The match, still held in her other hand, slipped. Flame met fuel in an instant, a soft whoosh igniting the spill and racing hungrily along the trails of kerosene toward the bed where Jonah lay half-conscious. Abigail's scream pierced the night, sharp and brief, as fire licked up the walls with terrifying speed. Elias and Eliza bolted up the ladder, but heat and smoke drove them back, the loft filling with choking blackness. Through the haze, they saw silhouettes, their mother beating at flames with a blanket, their father struggling to rise before the roof beams groaned and the entire upper level became an inferno. The twins stumbled outside into the cold, watching helplessly as the cabin became a pyre, orange light dancing across the surrounding trees and casting long, writhing shadows that seemed to reach toward them. No rain fell to quench it. The fire consumed everything with methodical thoroughness, reducing the home to glowing embers by dawn. When the ashes cooled enough to approach, Elias and Eliza sifted through the ruins, finding only charred bones too fused and fragmented to separate. The forest, which had whispered to them since childhood, now offered a different counsel, voices clearer than ever, weaving through the smoke-scented air, urging solitude, promising that the twins needed no one else to survive, that their bond was sanctuary enough against the world's cruelties. Alone amid the blackened timbers, they felt the weight of isolation settle not as grief, but as liberation, the voices growing insistent, guiding their hands as they began clearing space for whatever structure and life would rise from the destruction. By the spring of 1923, the forest had reclaimed much of the burned clearing, sending pale shoots of fireweed and young alder through the blackened soil as if eager to erase the memory of loss. Elias and Eliza, now 20, had rebuilt a smaller shelter deeper among the trees, its walls woven from saplings and bark in patterns that mimicked the veins of leaves. They moved through their days with the quiet efficiency of creatures born to the wild, trapping rabbits, gathering berries, and speaking less and less in the language of ordinary words. The private tongue of their childhood had returned, richer now, laced with tones that rose and fell like the wind threading through needles high above. On evenings when the light slanted low and golden through the canopy, the twins would walk to a small glade they had discovered years earlier, a perfect circle where no trees grew, ringed by ancient firs whose trunks bore strange, spiraled scars. There they sat facing one another on a fallen log softened by moss, knees touching, hands resting palm to palm. The voices that had murmured since infancy now spoke with unmistakable clarity, no longer fragments carried on the breeze but full sentences that seemed to rise from the earth itself. They promised the twins a lineage unbroken, a strength that would outlast the fleeting lives of those who clung to separation. The whispers wove images of a single, perfect bloodline, pure and eternal, capable of holding secrets the outside world feared to know. One night in late May, as the air grew thick with the scent of blooming dogwood and the first fireflies blinked like fallen stars, Elias felt the words form in his throat before he spoke them aloud. His voice, low and steady, mirrored Eliza's thoughts exactly. The love they bore each other was not the frail affection of strangers but the deep, inevitable pull of two halves seeking wholeness. Eliza's eyes, dark as wet shale, filled with tears that reflected the rising moon, and she answered without hesitation, her fingers tightening around his. The voices swelled in approval, threading through their shared breath, urging confession, promising that to deny this bond was to betray the very force that had brought them into being on that storm-lashed night 2 decades earlier. They spoke through the hours until dawn paled the sky, laying bare every hidden longing, every dream where their bodies had already entwined long before waking minds acknowledged the truth. Fear flickered briefly echoes of their parents' teachings, fragments of Bible verses heard in distant childhood, but the voices drowned them, gentle yet relentless, painting visions of children born of their union who would carry the forest's power in their veins, who would hear the whispers even louder, who would build something enduring where ordinary families crumbled. When the first birds began their tentative calls, Elias and Eliza rose together, faces flushed with a resolve that felt older than themselves. Hand in hand, they walked back through the mist-shrouded trees, the decision settling between them like a shared heartbeat, the voices humming in satisfaction as they drew the twins toward the forbidden threshold they were now ready to cross. The summer solstice of 1924 arrived under a swollen blood moon that hung low over the Oregon ridges, painting the forest in hues of rusted copper and deep crimson, as though the sky itself bled in anticipation. Elias and Eliza, drawn by an urgency that pulsed in their veins like a second heartbeat, left their shelter at twilight and followed a narrow deer path deeper into the woods than they had ever ventured. The air grew cooler with each step, heavy with the resinous breath of ancient trees whose trunks rose like cathedral pillars, their bark etched with patterns that twisted into faces when glimpsed from the corner of the eye. No birds sang, even the insects seemed hushed, as if the night held its breath for what was to come. They emerged into the hidden glade at moonrise, the same circle of bare earth they had known since childhood, but transformed now into something sacred and foreboding. The ring of firs leaned inward slightly, their needles forming a dense canopy that trapped the scarlet light and cast it downward in shifting pools. At the center stood a flat stone altar half buried in moss, its surface scarred by centuries of weather and something older, shallow grooves that caught the moonlight like channels meant for liquid offerings. The voices rose around them, no longer whispers threading through leaves but a resonant chorus rising from the ground itself, vibrating through their bones with words of binding and becoming. Elias carried a small bundle wrapped in doeskin, a bone-handled knife honed from obsidian traded years earlier from distant travelers, and 2 silver rings forged from melted coins their parents had once hidden beneath the floorboards. Eliza wore a simple gown of undyed linen, her dark hair loose and flowing like ink spilled across her shoulders. They stepped into the circle together, barefoot upon the cool earth, feeling it pulse faintly beneath their soles. Kneeling face to face across the stone, they spoke vows composed not from human tradition but from the language the forest had taught them, syllables that tasted of sap and iron, promises of eternal unity that echoed back from the trees in perfect harmony. When the words were complete, Elias drew the blade across his palm, a thin line of blood welling black in the red light. Eliza mirrored the motion without flinching, pressing her wound to his so their blood mingled and dripped together onto the altar's grooves. The earth drank it greedily, the stone darkening as though alive. They slipped the rings onto each other's fingers, the metal warming instantly against their skin. Then, beneath the watchful moon, they sealed the union with a kiss that tasted of salt and copper, bodies pressing close as the voices swelled into a triumphant roar that shook needles from the branches overhead. In that moment, something shifted in the glade, an exhalation from the depths of the woods, as if dormant forces long coiled beneath the roots stirred and unfurled, acknowledging the pact and binding themselves to the blood now offered freely. The moon climbed higher, bathing the newly bound pair in its unrelenting glow, while shadows lengthened and deepened around them, drawing tighter like a noose of living darkness eager to witness what this forbidden marriage would awaken next. The winter of 1925 pressed heavy upon the hidden glade, snow piling in silent drifts against the woven walls of the shelter Elias and Eliza now called home. 9 months had passed since the blood moon ritual, and Eliza's body had swelled with the weight of what they had wrought, her skin luminous against the dim firelight, veins tracing faint blue rivers beneath the surface. The voices, once insistent guides, had grown softer during her carrying, almost tender, humming lullabies that only she and Elias could hear, melodies that promised the child would be the first true vessel of the legacy they had sealed beneath the crimson sky. On a February night when the moon hung thin and silver, slicing pale light through the chinks in the bark walls, Eliza's pains began. Snow muffled the world outside, swallowing sound until the forest seemed to hold its breath once more. Elias knelt beside her on a bed of pine boughs and wolf pelts, his hand steady as he boiled water over the small hearth, crushing dried herbs the voices had taught them to gather: yarrow for bleeding, raspberry leaf for strength. Eliza's cries were low and controlled, rising only when the contractions crested, her dark hair clinging damply to her cheeks. Between waves, she clutched Elias's hand, their eyes locking in perfect understanding, the shared language passing reassurance without need for words. As dawn bled grey across the sky, the child finally slipped into Elias's waiting palms, a boy, slick and fierce, his first breath drawn with a cry that cut through the stillness like a blade. He was larger than expected, limbs strong and well-formed, skin pale as moonlight on fresh snow. But it was his eyes that stilled them both, wide and unblinking, the irises a shade paler than either parent's, almost colorless, reflecting the fire's glow like polished glass. Elias wrapped him in a soft doeskin blanket and laid him at Eliza's breast, where the infant latched with urgent hunger, tiny fingers curling possessively. Almost immediately, the boy's gaze shifted, focusing not on his mother's face but past her, toward the shadowed corner of the room where the firelight did not reach. His small body tensed, then relaxed, as though listening to something just beyond human hearing. Elias felt it too, a sudden surge in the ever-present whispers, a chorus rising in exultation, threading through the rafters and down into the earth. The voices spoke the child's name before either parent had chosen one, the syllables forming simultaneously in both their minds: Silas. And with that naming came the knowledge that he heard them clearly, more clearly than even Elias and Eliza had at birth, his pale eyes tracking invisible movements in the air, his breath syncing with rhythms older than the surrounding trees. Eliza stroked the downy hair on his head, exhaustion and triumph mingling in her smile, while Elias sat back on his heels, watching the infant's unnatural awareness bloom in the quiet hours after birth. The voices wove promises around the three of them now, thicker and more possessive, speaking of strength that would grow with each new generation, of gifts that would sharpen in the pure blood they had begun to cultivate. Snow continued to fall outside, sealing the shelter in a cocoon of white silence, while within, the first child of the forbidden union lay listening to secrets the forest had waited centuries to share, his tiny chest rising and falling in perfect time with the ancient pulse beneath the roots. The years that followed Silas's birth blurred into a shadowed tapestry woven from isolation and ritual, the forest folding ever tighter around the growing clan as if guarding a secret too potent for the outside world. By 1930, Eliza had borne 3 more children, 2 girls, Lydia and Myra, born in quick succession, and another boy, Caleb, whose arrival coincided with a summer drought that withered the underbrush to tinder. Each birth unfolded in the same woven shelter, now expanded into a warren of low rooms connected by narrow passages roofed with living sod, the walls thickened with mud and moss until the structure seemed less built than grown from the earth itself. Elias hunted and gathered with relentless efficiency, his frame lean and tireless, while Eliza tended the infants with a calm that bordered on reverence, her pale eyes reflecting the same glassy stillness now mirrored in all her offspring. The children matured swiftly, their bodies marked by the unmistakable stamp of shared blood, skin translucent over delicate blue veins, hair dark and straight as raven feathers, and eyes that caught light in unnatural ways, shifting from near black to silver depending on the angle of the sun. They moved through the woods with silent grace, speaking the family tongue that had evolved into something melodic and guttural, syllables laced with clicks and sighs that mimicked the wind through hollow trunks. Separation was unknown among them. They slept in tangled piles on fur-strewn floors, limbs entwined, breaths rising and falling in perfect unison as though sharing a single lung. Deeper in the forest, hidden from any stray trail, the family raised new dwellings, low domes of bent saplings covered in bark and needles, arranged in a widening spiral around the sacred glade where the blood moon rite had bound Elias and Eliza. Smoke from small, concealed fires rose only at night, thinning into the canopy before it could betray their presence. The voices guided every expansion, murmuring approval when a new room was added for growing numbers, suggesting placements that aligned with unseen ley lines threading beneath the soil. Inbreeding deepened with each generation. Silas, now broad-shouldered and strong, took Lydia as his mate in a ceremony echoing his parents', their union producing twins of their own whose fingers were slightly webbed and whose laughter carried an echo no human throat should make. Some children bore subtler gifts, heightened senses that allowed them to track prey by scent alone through pouring rain, or visions that came unbidden during fever dreams, revealing glimpses of strangers who would one day wander too close. Others carried visible marks, a 6th toe, eyes set fractionally too wide, skin that bruised to deep violet at the lightest touch. Yet none were cast aside. The voices insisted every variation strengthened the bloodline, weaving new threads into the pattern begun decades earlier. The clan grew to 12 souls, then 15, their pale faces emerging from shadow only when necessity demanded, their footsteps leaving no trace on the needle-strewn ground as they tended hidden gardens of night-blooming plants and caches of dried meat. The forest itself seemed to conspire in their concealment, branches lowering to screen paths, mist rising to blur outlines, roots shifting to trip any outsider who strayed near the spiral's edge. By the late 1930s, faint threads of rumor had begun to drift from the dense Oregon wilderness into the scattered logging camps and small towns along the valley edges, carried on the tongues of trappers who returned with fewer pelts than expected and eyes that avoided direct gaze. They spoke in lowered voices of lights flickering deep in the forest where no homestead should be, of trails that ended abruptly in walls of impenetrable brush, of human shapes glimpsed at twilight pale, silent figures that melted into shadow before a rifle could be raised. Hikers vanished with unsettling regularity, a surveyor in 1936, 2 young botanists from Portland in 1938, their packs found neatly stacked beside cold campfires, contents untouched. The disappearances were blamed on bears or exposure, but whispers persisted of cries echoing through the trees at night, cries that sounded almost like laughter. In the autumn of 1941, those whispers reached the ears of Harlan Graves, a private investigator from Salem whose reputation rested on unraveling cases the state police deemed unsolvable. Lean and sharp-featured, with a persistent limp from an old gunshot wound, Graves had grown weary of divorce work and insurance fraud. The missing persons files, stacked untouched on a sheriff's desk during a rain-soaked visit, stirred something dormant in him, a need to chase shadows that others dismissed. He studied the maps, noted the clustering of incidents around an unmapped section of the Cascades, and set out alone with a pack, a .38 revolver, and a notebook bound in cracked leather. Graves entered the forest from an abandoned logging road, following faint game trails that twisted deeper than any chart suggested. Days blurred into one another under the perpetual dimness of the canopy, his compass needle twitching erratically as though disturbed by unseen currents. On the seventh evening, exhausted and low on provisions, he stumbled upon signs no woodsman could ignore: a patch of ground cleared of needles yet covered in moss too uniform to be natural, a faint scent of wood smoke carried on air that should have been still. Pushing through a curtain of hanging vines, he emerged into the outer ring of the hidden settlement, low, organic domes half swallowed by the earth, their entrances curtained with woven bark. Smoke rose in thin, disciplined threads from concealed vents, vanishing into the branches above. Before he could retreat, pale faces appeared at the edges of his vision, children first, then adults, all moving with unnerving silence, eyes catching the failing light like animals adapted to perpetual gloom. They did not approach aggressively but simply watched, heads tilted in identical angles, as though listening to instructions he could not hear. Graves felt the hairs rise on his neck, the sudden conviction that he had crossed into a place where the rules of the outside world no longer applied. Somewhere deeper in the spiral of dwellings, a low humming began, rising from the ground itself, threading through roots and soil until it vibrated in his chest. The figures parted slightly, revealing a narrow path leading toward the heart of their domain, an invitation or a trap he could not yet discern, drawing the investigator forward into the thickening dusk where the forest's ancient patience waited to judge what he would uncover next. As autumn bled into the harsher chills of 1942, Harlan Graves's intrusion hung over the hidden settlement like a storm cloud refusing to break, his notebook filled with frantic sketches of the spiral dwellings and hurried notes on the pale inhabitants who watched him with unblinking stillness. The clan had allowed him to retreat that first evening, melting back into the shadows as silently as they had appeared, but the voices churned in unrest, rising from the roots in agitated waves that vibrated through the earth and into the bones of every family member. Elias and Eliza felt it most acutely, the whispers turning sharp and demanding during the long nights, painting vivid warnings of exposure, of outsiders tearing apart the pure bloodline they had nurtured through decades of sacrifice. The voices spoke of balance, of a price required to renew the protection that had cloaked their domain since the blood moon rite. They named the threat clearly, the limping man with his questions and his gun, and insisted that only an offering freely given from within the clan could seal the breach he had created. Elias resisted at first, his face gaunt in the firelight as he paced the central chamber, but Eliza, ever the deeper listener, knelt in the glade alone under a waning moon, pressing her palms to the moss-covered altar until the stone warmed and the chorus swelled into undeniable command. The sacrifice must be one of their own, young enough for the blood to carry potent innocence, yet old enough to understand the necessity. The choice fell upon Myra, the quieter of the twin girls born to Eliza years earlier, her frame slight and her eyes the palest silver, marked from birth with a sensitivity that made her weep at the slightest discord in the voices. On a night when frost silvered the needles and the air carried the metallic tang of coming snow, the clan gathered in the sacred circle, their pale forms emerging from the domes like ghosts summoned by ritual. Myra walked forward without protest, guided by Lydia's gentle hand, her small face serene as though dreaming awake. The obsidian knife, passed down since the founding rite, gleamed black in Elias's grip, his arm steady despite the tremor in his breath. The act was swift, a single cut across the throat, blood spilling hot and dark over the altar's ancient grooves, soaking into the earth with a sound like satisfied sigh. The voices roared in ecstasy, a wind whipping through the treetops without touching the ground, needles raining down in a brief, frenzied shower. Myra's body slumped forward, cradled by Silas and Caleb, who carried her deeper into the woods where roots would claim her swiftly. The clan felt the barrier strengthen immediately, an invisible veil thickening around their spiral, mist rising thicker than ever to blur paths and distort sounds. Yet in the hush that followed, as blood cooled on the stone and the family returned to their dwellings with faces streaked in crimson ritual marks, new threads wove into the whispers, darker, angrier tones that slithered not from the earth but from the spaces between trees, vengeful echoes stirred by the violence offered in their name. Shapes began to linger at the edges of vision during watches, tall and indistinct, their outlines fraying like smoke, drawing closer with each passing night as though the sacrifice had appeased one ancient force only to enrage another long buried beneath the glade. The voices of protection grew strained, overlapping with these new presences that carried the chill of resentment, watching the clan with patience older than the forest itself, waiting for the next imbalance that would justify their claim upon the bloodline so carefully preserved in the waning months of 1943. As war raged far beyond the veiled borders of the Oregon wilderness, Harlan Graves returned not as the cautious intruder of 2 years prior, but as a man hollowed by obsession, his limp more pronounced, his eyes ringed with the sleepless shadows of one who has brushed against truths too vast for ordinary minds. He had spent the intervening time in Salem's dusty archives and remote county offices, piecing together fragments of old surveys, faded land grants, and whispered folktales of a cursed tract where settlers vanished and trees grew twisted. Armed with a battered journal now thick with annotations, he slipped past the outer mists on a fog-choked morning, guided by landmarks only he seemed to recognize, drawn inexorably toward the spiral heart of the clan's domain. The settlement had changed in subtle, unsettling ways. The domes appeared older yet stronger, bark fused seamlessly into living wood as though the structures breathed with the forest. Fewer faces watched from the edges this time. Instead, an oppressive silence pressed down, broken only by the faint, rhythmic humming that seemed to rise from the soil itself. Graves moved cautiously along the concealed paths, revolver heavy in his coat pocket, until he reached the sacred glade at dusk. There, beneath a sky bruised with storm clouds, he found Elias and Eliza waiting as though summoned by his approach, older now, hair threaded with premature silver, yet still mirror images, their pale eyes reflecting the last light like still water over deep abysses. They did not flee or attack. Instead, they parted silently, revealing the moss-covered altar stained darker than memory allowed. Graves knelt, scraping away centuries of lichen with trembling fingers, uncovering carvings beneath spiraled symbols not of human origin, grooves worn deep by offerings far older than the twins' blood moon rite. As rain began to fall in cold, deliberate drops, the voices that had haunted the clan surged around him, no longer confined to their blood but spilling into the open air, layered and discordant. He heard the protective chorus that had guided Elias and Eliza since birth, but woven through it now were the vengeful tones that had risen after Myra's sacrifice, older, angrier, speaking of a bargain struck long before the first white settlers crept into these woods, a pact with entities that dwelled beneath roots and stone, demanding purity in exchange for concealment. Piece by piece, the truth uncoiled in Graves's mind like smoke. The land itself was the curse, awakened by the twins' forbidden union yet predating them by millennia, feeding on the intensified essence of a bloodline deliberately concentrated. The protective voices were merely one face of the entity, luring the clan deeper into isolation and consanguinity to ripen the harvest, while the vengeful presences were the backlash of that same force when balance tipped too far. Elias and Eliza stood motionless as understanding dawned on the investigator's face, their expressions neither defiant nor pleading, only resigned, as though they had always known an outsider would one day see the full pattern. Lightning forked overhead, illuminating the glade in stark white, and in that flash Graves glimpsed the true shapes gathering beyond the tree line, not shadows but absences, voids where light bent wrong, closing the circle tighter around the altar where the dynasty's foundation had been laid. Rain intensified, washing fresh earth from the stone's crevices, revealing channels that pulsed faintly with something darker than blood, while the discordant voices rose to a crescendo that threatened to shatter the fragile veil between the clan's carefully guarded world and the ancient hunger stirring beneath it.